for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
Welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. We have got quite a few topics to discuss. The minimum wage in Michigan is going to increase after the Michigan State Supreme Court said that Republicans could not pass the legislation the way that they did. We'll tell you all about it in just a couple of minutes. Plus, we have a prisoner swap between Russia and several countries, including the U.S. We'll have all the details on that breaking news and much more to get to today. Before we start with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and KCGM in Kabul, Missouri. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. We are recording this show on Thursday, August 1st, 2024, and we have breaking news. This is Carol E. Lee, Aurora Almondral, Keir Simmons, and Andrea Mitchell writing for NBC News. This is dated August 1st. 4 U.S. residents, including journalist Evan Gershkovich and Marine veteran Paul Whelan, were released Thursday, part of a major multinational prisoner exchange the likes of which have not been seen since the Cold War. The massive deal, cut among 7 nations, involves 24 people, including 5 Germans and 7 Russian citizens held in Russia, and 8 Russians imprisoned in the U.S., Germany, Slovenia, Norway, and Poland. Gershkovich, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, was arrested in March 2023 while reporting in Yekaterinburg, an industrial city east of Moscow. In July, he was convicted of espionage in a Russian court in a trial widely condemned as a sham, as his publication vociferously advocated for his release across its front pages. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Whelan, a businessman who had been detained since visiting Russia for a friend's wedding in 2018, was also convicted of espionage and had been serving a 16-year sentence in a penal colony. The U.S. has denied those charges. Whelan was excluded from 2 previous prisoner exchanges, and in an interview from prison last December, Whelan told the BBC that he considered the U.S.'s decision to leave him behind a serious betrayal. The prisoners in Russia were flown to Turkey before heading home. President Joe Biden had gathered with the family members of those being returned to the U.S. ahead of the swap being announced. That's according to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Also released in the prison exchange, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty journalist Alsul Kermasheva. Also released Vladimir Kara-Murza Jr., a dual Russian-British national and U.S. permanent resident, who was jailed on treason charges for 25 years in April of 2023. So there's the latest with that. We're going to see if we can get some comments from President Biden on the swap.
Nothing.
President Biden,
What a chance this whole
President Trump has said repeatedly that he could have gotten the hostages out without giving anything in exchange. What do you say to that? What do you say to President Trump now, former president?
Why didn't he do it when he was president?
Sir, what a chance.
Nice and tight right there. I love it. Short and sweet. That was from NBC News. We caught the tail end of President Biden's speech to the U.S. regarding the prisoner exchange. So there you go, folks. Great news out of the United States today. So Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan heading back home. That is very good news today. All right, let's get back to our other big news today. This is Anna Liz Nichols writing for the Michigan Advance. This is dated July 31st. Come February, the minimum wage will rise significantly and tipped wages will begin to phase out after a Michigan Supreme Court opinion published Wednesday found that the legislature subverted the rights of citizens in 2018 by using an adopt and amend strategy to kill two ballot initiatives. On February 21st, 2025, the minimum wage in Michigan will be more than $12 an hour, up from $10.33, and tipped wages will rise over the next few years until subminimum wages are phased out. And a new paid sick leave policy will take effect, requiring employers with fewer than 10 employees to offer up to 40 hours of paid sick time annually, and employers with 10 or more employees to give up to 72 hours. In a 4-3 opinion, the Michigan Supreme Court reviewed the then GOP-controlled legislature's decision in 2018 to adopt two citizen-led ballot initiatives increasing the minimum wage and mandating sick leave, keeping them off the ballot that year. In its lame duck session, lawmakers only went back and gutted the measures with amendments. The opinion reads this way, quote, "It is undisputed that under the Michigan Constitution, the legislature would not have been able to make those amendments by a simple majority vote if the initiatives had appeared on the ballot and had been approved by a majority of Michigan voters in the 2018 election. Rather, it chose a path not set forth in the Constitution. It adopted the proposed laws as written on the initiative petitions and then amended those laws as soon as the election was over." End of quote. In a concurring opinion, Court of Appeals Judge Michael J. Kelly called the legislature's actions a ploy, quote, anti-democratic, end of quote, in intent and opposed to what the drafters of the Constitution contemplated in managing the power of the legislature. Kelly said, quote, "If the individuals responsible for this maneuver ever wonder why public opinion polls constantly cast politicians low when it comes to the virtue of trust, they need no look further than what they did here. It is a direct assault on one of the rights our founding fathers and the drafters of our state constitution held dear, the right of the citizens to petition their government. When the history of this legislature is written, it is difficult to imagine anybody saying that this was their finest hour." End of quote. Rokesha O'Neill, a Detroit restaurant worker, praised the ruling in a news release from the Restaurant Opportunity Center of Michigan. O'Neill said, quote, "This victory truly belongs to restaurant workers and other Michigan workers like me who mainly depend on our jobs and paychecks to make ends meet. By working for jobs that offer meager pay and yet continuing to contribute to the economic vibrancy of our state, our sacrifices have paid off. I have never been more hopeful than I am today that I will get a higher paycheck, better protection when I get sick, and a much brighter tomorrow." End of quote. Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks had this to say, quote, "The then Republican majority made a deceitful bait and switch on the very people they were sworn to serve, and this lengthy battle was caused by their tactics. Regardless, today marks a new chapter where legislators and residents alike will have a clear understanding of the citizen initiative process." End of quote. Although there were condemnations of the adopt and amend strategy, there are fears that employees that work on tip wages will see mass layoffs. Representative Noah Arbit, Democrat of West Bloomfield, voiced his concerns on X Wednesday, saying, quote, 40% of restaurants across Michigan could go out of business when the tip credit skyrockets. Thousands of servers will be laid off. I look forward to working with colleagues and partners on a fix that will not leave our beloved community restaurants on a cliff edge this winter. End of quote. House Minority Leader Matt Hall, Republican of Richland Township, is calling on Democrats who now have the majority in both chambers to reconvene at the Capitol and come up with solutions for all the workers who will ultimately earn less on the tip system or get laid off due to increased costs for businesses. Increased costs for businesses. Look, I'm just going to tell it bluntly. The restaurants have raised prices right across the menu, and there hasn't been an increase in wages. For them to say, oh, we increase the wages, we're going to have to raise our prices more, is ridiculous. They've already raised them. Why? Because they can. Because it's greed. It is greed. Let me repeat, greed. Here's what Hall said in the statement, quote, the legislature must return to the Capitol immediately because this decision will completely disrupt the livelihoods of hardworking Michiganders. Restaurants and other small businesses will have to raise their prices, tip workers will take home less pay, and some people will lose their jobs. The court has ruled, and now it's time for the people's representatives to take action. End of quote. The people's representatives. That's the Republican Party. Really? Yeah. Save My Tip spokesperson John Selleck also called on Governor Gretchen Whitmer to step in after the quote-unquote devastating decision. Selleck said, quote, servers and bartenders take these jobs because through their own efforts they can make far more than minimum wage. In their own words, they are now sure to suffer from lost income and lost jobs as the hospitality industry is thrown into economic turmoil because of the secretive dark money funded out-of-state group. End of quote. Really? No, other states that have implemented raises in the minimum wage where they get rid of the tip wage, guess what? Restaurants are thriving. Workers are making more money, more than they ever have, to the point that they're opening restaurants left and right in Oregon. Sorry, that's the truth. That's what happens when you raise the minimum wage. When people can pay more and get better wages, they're going to, guess what? Spend more. It's unbelievable. These people don't understand economics. Brian Kelly, who was the Republican lieutenant governor in 2018, is now the president and CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Here's what Kelly said, quote, draconian new mandates that drastically alter employer-employee relationships and impose heavy administrative burdens is the opposite of what empowers small businesses to grow in our communities. During a time where policymakers are constantly talking about how to grow our population, these types of policies are not productive or fruitful for our future as a state. We urge lawmakers to act swiftly but deliberately to protect small business owners from the fallout of this unfortunate ruling. End of quote. Unfortunate ruling. Yeah, my ass there, Brian. Go suck up to your rich people a little more there, buddy. About 91% of restaurant owners said they will raise prices on menus and rooms, and 58% said they'll lay off employees to offset changes to minimum wage and sick leave. That is according to a survey published by the Michigan Restaurant and Lodging Association in September 2022. Well, like I said, when their business increases because people who work can actually afford to go out to eat, they'll think twice about that. Got news for you. Again, look what happened in Oregon. More restaurants now than ever before. Workers are making fantastic wages. Menu prices didn't go up that much. Sorry, they didn't. And like I said, more restaurants now than ever. It's proven. Unreal. It's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. Republicans always want to lower wages. They want poor people to remain poor. Unreal. That's been the Republican theme for the last 100 years. People should make less money. Workers, the owners of these businesses, should screw their employees and take in more money and not shell out to their employees. I don't understand it. Like I said, it's greed. It's absolute, pure, 100% greed. Oh boy, speaking of greedy, let's talk Donald Trump for a little bit. Donald Trump has stuck his foot in his mouth again, big time. This is Matt Brown and Michelle L. Price writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 31st out of Chicago. Donald Trump falsely suggested Kamala Harris and misled voters about her race as Trump appeared before the National Association of Black Journalists in Chicago Wednesday in an interview that quickly turned hostile. Trump claimed that Harris, the first black woman and Asian American to serve as vice president, had in the past only promoted her Indian heritage. While addressing the group's annual convention, Trump said, quote, I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black? End of quote. Harris is the daughter of a Jamaican father and an Indian mother, both immigrants to the U.S. As an undergraduate, Harris attended Howard University, one of the nation's most prominent historically black colleges and universities, where she also pledged the historically black sorority Alpha Kappa Alpha. As a U.S. Senator, Harris was a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, supporting her colleagues' legislation to strengthen voting rights and reform policing. Trump has leveled a wide range of criticism at Harris since she replaced President Joe Biden atop the likely Democratic ticket last week. Throughout his political career, Trump has repeatedly questioned the backgrounds of opponents who are racial minorities. White House Press Secretary Karen Jean-Pierre was asked during her briefing with reporters on Wednesday about Trump's remarks and responded with disbelief, initially murmuring, quote, wow, end of quote. Jean-Pierre, who is black, called what Trump said, quote, repulsive. She added this, quote, it's insulting and no one has any right to tell someone who they are, how they identify, end of quote. Trump has repeatedly attacked his opponents and critics on the basis of race. He rose to prominence in Republican politics by propagating false theories that President Barack Obama, the nation's first black president, was not born in the United States. Birtherism, as it's become known, was just the start of Trump's history of questioning the credentials and qualifications of black politicians. During this year's Republican primary, he once referred to former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, the daughter of Indian immigrants, as, quote, Nimbra, end of quote. Trump's appearance Wednesday at the annual gathering of black journalists immediately became heated, with Trump sparring with interviewer Rachel Scott of ABC News and accusing her of giving him a very rude introduction with a tough first question about his past criticism of black people and black journalists, his attack on black prosecutors who have pursued cases against him, and the dinner he had at his Florida club with a white supremacist. Trump said, quote, I think it's disgraceful that I came here in good spirit. I love the black population of this country. I've done so much for the black population of this country. End of quote. Trump continued his attacks on Scott's network, ABC News, which he has been arguing should not host the next presidential debate, despite his earlier agreement with the Biden campaign. In other words, he's a chicken. He's backing out of it. The Republican also repeated his false claim that immigrants in the country illegally are taking black jobs. When pushed by Scott on what constituted a black job, Trump responded by saying, well, any job, drawing groans from the room. At one point, he said, quote, I have been the best president for the black population since Abraham Lincoln, end of quote. Really? The audience responded with a mix of boos and some applause. Scott asked Trump about his pledge to pardon people convicted for their roles in the January 6, 2021 traitorous riot at the U.S. Capitol. I added traitorous. And specifically whether he would pardon those who assaulted police officers. Trump said, quote, oh, absolutely I would. If they're innocent, I would pardon them. End of quote. Yeah, pardon them. Bullshit. They're not innocent. They're guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Just like Trump is guilty of 34 crimes. He ought to know what guilty is. Scott, he certainly doesn't know what innocent is. That's for damn sure. Scott pointed out that they have been convicted and therefore are not innocent. Trump said, quote, well, they were convicted by a very, very tough system, end of quote. Oh, brother. He then falsely claimed that people were not arrested in the unrest in Minneapolis and other cities following the death of George Floyd by Minneapolis police in 2020. Trump also sought to compare the 2021 insurrection at the Capitol to pro-Gaza protests near the same building last week, in which there were skirmishes with police and many demonstrators were arrested for publicly defacing property with anti-Semitic tropes and propaganda. There were no reported injuries of police or protesters at the recent demonstrations, unlike the Capitol riot, where a mob of Trump's angry supporters assaulted more than 140 police officers. Once again, traitorous riot. They are traitors. They don't belong in this country. They are traitors. And you know the only sentence for traitors is right there it is. As Trump made the comparison, a man in the back of the room shouted, quote, "Sir, have you no shame?" End of quote. Of course not. I can tell you the answer to that one. Of course not. He is a narcissist. He's only in it for himself, folks. Trump's invitation to address the organization sparked an intense internal debate among NABJ that spilled online. Organizations for journalists of color typically invite presidential candidates to speak at their summer gatherings in election years. As he campaigns for the White House a third time, Trump has sought to appear outside his traditional strongholds of support, and his campaign has touted his efforts to try to win over Black Americans, who have been Democrats' most committed voting bloc. His campaign has emphasized his messages on the economy and immigration as part of his appeal, but some of his outreach has played on some racial stereotypes, including the suggestion that African Americans would empathize with the criminal charges he has faced in his promotion of branded sneakers. Here, I don't have Jordans, but you can get these Trumps. Yeah, that's about what it is. Trump and the NABJ also have a tense history over his treatment of black women journalists. In 2018, the NABJ condemned Trump for repeatedly using words such as stupid, loser, and nasty to describe black women journalists. The Harris campaign said ahead of Trump's appearance that Trump would lie about his record. Jasmine Harris, the director of black media for the campaign, said in a statement, quote, "Not only does Donald Trump have a history of demeaning NABJ members and honorees who remain pillars of the black press, he also has a history of attacking the media and working against the vital role the press play in our democracy." End of quote. The vice president is not scheduled to appear at the convention, but the NABJ said in a statement posted on X that it was in conversation with her campaign to have her appear either virtually or in person for a conversation in September. Trump posted on a social media network that he was told he cannot do the event virtually. Trump wrote, quote, "She declined and I'm getting ready to land in Chicago in order to be there. Now I am told that she is doing the event on Zoom. What's going on here?" End of quote. Trump later Wednesday was scheduled to hold a campaign rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So there you go, folks. That's Donald Trump for you. Racist, sexist, creepy, weird. Yes, he's weird. And so are his followers. You're all weird. Maggots are weird. I hope X tries to pull down my account because I'm calling him weird. Because Elon Musk is just as weird. Why would somebody spend $45 million every month to prop up an orange, fascist, wannabe, tin pot dictator? Answer that question for me there, Elon, you son of a bitch. When it's time to eat the rich, you're going to be among the first, buddy. Got news for you. Right now, let's get to our next story. This is Abby Sewell writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 31st out of Beirut. Hamas's top political leader was killed Wednesday by a pre-dawn airstrike in the Iranian capital, Iran and the militant group said, blaming Israel for a shock assassination that risked escalating into an all-out regional war. Iran's supreme leader vowed revenge against Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel will exact a heavy price from any aggression against us on any front, but did not mention the killing. He added, quote, "There are challenging days ahead," end of quote. Israel had pledged to kill Ismail Haniyeh and other Hamas leaders over the group's October 7th attack on southern Israel that sparked the war in Gaza. The strike came just after Haniyeh had attended the inauguration of Iran's new president in Tehran, and hours after Israel targeted a top commander in Iran's ally Hezbollah in the Lebanese capital of Beirut. The assassination was potentially explosive amid the region's volatile, intertwined conflicts because of its target, its timing, and the decision to carry it out in Tehran. Most dangerous was the potential to push Iran and Israel into direct confrontation if Iran retaliates. The U.S. and other nations scrambled to prevent a wider, deadlier conflict. In a statement on his official website, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said revenge was our duty and that Israel, quote, had prepared a harsh punishment for itself, end of quote, by killing, quote, a dear guest in our home, end of quote. Dear guest, my ass. Not that I'm a fan of Netanyahu, but sorry, not a fan of Hamas either. Two things can be true at the same time. And not a fan of Iran either, for that matter. Bitter regional rivals Israel and Iran risked plunging into war earlier this year when Israel hit Iran's embassy in Damascus in April. Iran retaliated and Israel countered in an unprecedented exchange of strikes on each other's soil, but international efforts succeeded in containing that cycle before it spun out of control. Hania's killing also could prompt Hamas to pull out of negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release deal in the 10-month-old war in Gaza, which U.S. mediators had said they were making progress. And it could inflame already rising tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, which international diplomats were trying to contain after a weekend rocket attack that killed 12 young people in the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. Israel carried out a rare strike Tuesday evening in the Lebanese capital that is said killed a top Hezbollah commander allegedly behind the rocket strike. Hezbollah, which denied any role in the Golan strike, confirmed the death of Fuad Shakur on Wednesday, saying he was in the building that was hit. The strike also killed 3 women and 2 children, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said there was no sign that an escalation is imminent in the Middle East and that a ceasefire agreement for Gaza was still possible. He also said the U.S. could not independently confirm reports of what occurred in Tehran. The key question is whether Israel told the U.S., its top ally, ahead of time. Asked about Hania's killing, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, quote, "This is something we were not aware of or involved in," end of quote. Speaking on Channel News Asia, Blinken said he would not speculate about the impact on ceasefire efforts. Khalil al-Hayya, a powerful figure within Hamas who was close to Haniya, told journalists in Iran that whoever replaces Haniya will follow the same vision regarding negotiations to end the war and continue in the same policy of resistance against Israel. Hamas's main consultative body was expected to meet soon, likely after Haniya's funeral Friday in Qatar, to name a successor. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said he still had hopes for a diplomatic solution on the Israeli-Lebanon border. He said, quote, "I don't think the war is inevitable. I think there's always room and opportunity for diplomacy, and I'd like to see parties pursue those opportunities," end of quote. But international diplomats trying to diffuse tensions were alarmed. One Western diplomat whose country has worked to prevent an Israeli-Hezbollah escalation said the strikes in Beirut and Tehran have almost killed hopes for a Gaza ceasefire and could push the Middle East into a devastating regional war. The diplomat spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive situation. Israel often refrains from commenting on assassinations carried out by its Mossad intelligence agency or strikes on other countries. In a statement by his office, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said Israel doesn't want war after its strike on the Hezbollah commander in Beirut. Quote, "But we are preparing for all possibilities," end of quote. He did not mention the Haniya killing, and a U.S. provided summary of his call with Austin did not mention it. The killing of Haniya abroad comes as Israel has not had a clear success in killing Hamas's top leadership in Gaza, who are believed to be primarily responsible for planning the October 7th attack. Haniya left the Gaza Strip in 2019 and had lived in exile in Qatar. Israel has targeted Hamas figures in Lebanon and Syria during the war, but going after Haniya in Iran was vastly more sensitive. Israel has operated there in the past. It is suspected of running a years-long assassination campaign against Iranian nuclear scientists. In 2020, a top Iranian military nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was killed by a remote-controlled machine gun while traveling in a car outside Tehran. During Haniya's last hours in Iran, a close ally of Hamas, He was smiling and clapping at the inauguration ceremony of the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Associated Press photos showed him seated alongside leaders from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militant group and Hezbollah. An Iranian media showed him and Pezeshkian hugging. Hania had earlier met with Khamenei. Hours later, the strike hit a residence Hania uses in Tehran, killing him, Hamas said. One of his bodyguards was killed, Iranian officials said. Hamas official al-Haya later said on Iranian state television that Hania was killed by a missile. All right, so that's the latest in what's happening with the Gaza war. Right now, let's take a look at finances and the Federal Reserve. This is Christopher Rugaber writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 31st out of Washington. The Federal Reserve said Wednesday that greater progress has been made in reducing inflation to its 2% target, a sign that the central bank is moving closer toward cutting its key interest rate for the first time in 4 years. In a statement issued after it concluded its two-day meeting, the Fed also said that job gains have moderated and acknowledged that the unemployment rate has risen. The Fed is required by Congress to pursue stable prices and maximum employment, and the statement said the central bank is attentive to the risks to both goals, a major shift after several years of focusing exclusively on combating inflation. A greater focus on the employment half of the Fed's mandate, along with cooling inflation, would support the case for a rate cut in the coming months. Fed policymakers also chose to keep their key rate at a 23-year high of 5.3%, even as many Democratic elected officials and some economists have pushed for lower rates to bolster the economy and prevent job cuts. Republicans, including Donald Trump, have argued that a rate cut before the election would appear politically motivated. At a news conference Wednesday, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said that if inflation continues to cool, quote, a rate cut could be on the table in the September meeting. We're getting closer to that point at which it'll be appropriate to reduce our policy rate, but we're not quite at that point, end of quote. Before the Fed's decision, financial market traders had priced in 100% odds that the central bank would reduce its benchmark rate at its September 17th and 18th meeting, according to futures markets. The Fed typically seeks to avoid surprising investors with its rate decisions. Stocks added a bit to earlier gains, and Treasury yields eased after the Federal Reserve held its main interest rate at a two-decade high, but gave some indication that an easing may soon be on the way. The S&P 500 was up 2% around 3:10 Eastern Time. The Fed is seeking to strike a delicate balance and wants to keep rates high enough for long enough to quell inflation, which has fallen to 2.5% from a peak 2 years ago of 7.1%, according to its preferred measure. But it also wants to avoid keeping borrowing costs so high that it triggers a recession. So far, it is on track for a so-called soft landing in which inflation falls to 2% without a recession. Yet, with the unemployment rate ticking higher for 3 months in a row, some economists have raised concerns that the Fed should have cut rates Wednesday or should cut them more quickly later this year. Bharat Ramamurthy, an advisor at the American Economic Liberties Project and former economist in the Biden White House, said on a phone call with reporters, quote, the finish line is in sight and it would be tragic for the Fed to stumble and fall with 1/10 of a mile left in the marathon, which is what I think they would be doing if they don't start cutting, end of quote. Also Wednesday, 3 Democratic senators led by Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts urged Powell in a letter to cut rates. The letter charged that a failure to reduce borrowing costs soon would suggest the Fed is, quote, giving in to bullying, end of quote, and would itself be a political move. In the latest piece of good news on price increases, last Friday the government said that yearly inflation fell to 2.5% in July, according to the Fed's preferred inflation measure. That is down from 2.6% the previous month and the lowest since February 2021, when inflation was just starting to accelerate. At the same time, the unemployment rate has risen by nearly a half percentage point this year to a still low 4.1%, and hiring has slowed. Powell and other Fed officials have highlighted they are increasingly focused on the risk that the job market could falter, another reason markets expect rate cuts soon. The government will issue the latest jobs numbers on Friday, And economists forecast that it will say employers added 175,000 jobs in July, while the unemployment rate remained at 4.1%. So there's some good news in the economy. At least the market's up, which means your 401ks and retirement packages are increasing. That's about the only good news there. Right now, let's get to our next story. This is Terry Spencer writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 30th out of Plantation, Florida. Listen to this, folks. A Florida school employee who let her transgender daughter play on her high school girls' volleyball team is being suspended for 10 days after the district's board found on Tuesday that she violated state law, but said firing her would be too severe. The Broward County School Board voted 5-4 to suspend without pay Jessica Norton's employment at Monarch High School, where her 16-year-old daughter played on the varsity volleyball team the last 2 seasons. She can no longer work as a computer information specialist, but must be given a job with equal pay and responsibility. The board found that Norton's actions violated the state's Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which bars transgender females from playing girls' high school sports. Republican Governor Ron DeSantis and the state legislature adopted it in 2021 over the Broward Board's opposition. Board member Debbie Hickson, who proposed the censure, said, quote, "Our employee made a choice not to follow the law," end of quote. She added, quote, "It was a first offense. We would not terminate someone on their first offense," end of quote. Norton, who was removed from the school after the violation was discovered in November and then placed on paid leave, called the vote an incorrect decision but said it was better than being fired. She said she wasn't sure if she would accept the punishment and return to work. She wanted to talk it over with her daughter, who left the school even though she had been class president and a homecoming princess. She said maybe they could return together. Norton said, quote, "I did nothing wrong, nothing," end of quote. Treatment of transgender children has been a hot-button issue across the country over the last few years. Florida is among at least 25 states that adopted bans on gender-affirming care for minors and one of at least 24 states that's adopted a law banning transgender women and girls from certain women's and girls' sports. The Nortons are plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit trying to block Florida's law as a violation of their daughter's civil rights. That lawsuit remains pending. During Tuesday's hour-long debate, Hickson proposed Norton's punishment after casting the deciding vote against an earlier motion which called for a 5-day suspension with no change in jobs. She said that was not severe enough. It failed by a 5-4 vote. But Hickson argued firing Norton was too harsh for a 7-year employee with sterling evaluations and a caring reputation among children. Hickson said, quote, "This isn't somebody who abused or harmed children. This is really about not following the law," end of quote. Hickson said, still, Norton put the district in a legally difficult spot by falsely attesting her child was born female on her state athletic eligibility form. The Florida Athletic Association fined Monarch $16,500 for violating the act, put the school on probation, and the district could be sued under the act if another student she believes was kept off the volleyball team and lost scholarship opportunities because of Norton's daughter. Wow. Hickson said she wanted Norton moved from her job as a computer information specialist because in that position, she could learn of another transgender student who was playing girls' sport and might not report that to administrators. Hickson said, quote, "That puts us as a school district in a bad place," end of quote. The 4 other yes votes believed a 5-day suspension or no punishment was appropriate, but agreed to the 10-day ban as a compromise they could live with. They pointed to previous 3, 5, and 10-day suspensions that were given to employees who had physically or verbally abused students as evidence Norton was being punished too harshly. Member Alan Zeman said, quote, "I believe this case is unique. You can correctly surmise that there have been problems with how we have dealt with it. You can also correctly surmise that rules and laws have been broken, but I think it is important that we come up with a solution that is consistent with the others," end of quote. At least 3 board members supported Superintendent Howard Hepburn's recommendation that Norton be fired because she had knowingly violated the law. Hepburn had overridden the committee's recommendation that Norton be suspended 10 days. Member Tori Alston said he believes the past suspension cited by Norton supporters were too lax and shouldn't preclude them from firing her. He said the board was sending the message that it would go soft on employees who violate statutes simply because they disagree with them. Alston said, quote, "I have zero tolerance for breaking the law," end of quote. Norton and her husband stormed out of the meeting when member Brenda Pham repeatedly called her child a boy. Pham argued that Norton should face criminal charges, though the Fairness Act only carries civil penalties aimed at violating schools. She compared Norton to a parent who falsifies an address to get their child into a better school, an act that is a crime under Florida law. Pham said she supports the Fairness Act because it protects biological girls from having to compete against transgender girls who may be bigger and stronger. Norton and her supporters have argued her daughter has been on puberty blockers and estrogen for several years and has no physical advantages over her teammates or opposing teams. Pham said, quote, "This was not a question about her son or her family. It was an issue about what she did as an employee and how she harmed others," end of quote. She later denied misgendering Norton's child, saying she was quoting from the newspaper article. Norton, after the meeting, said Pham intentionally misgendered her child to anger her. Norton said, quote, "It worked. I don't think that a school board member should be misgendering children. It's a horrible thing," end of quote. Yep, got that right. Yep, Brenda Pham deserves douchebag of the week for her actions. Unbelievable. Actually, let's go ahead to our next story here. We're going to skip that one. This is an update to Rudy Giuliani's bankruptcy case. This is Dave Collins writing for the Associated Press dated July 31st. Rudy Giuliani has agreed to a last-minute deal to end his personal bankruptcy case and pay about $400,000 to a financial advisor hired by his creditors, avoiding a potential deep dive into the former New York City mayor's finances that was threatened by a federal judge. The agreement was filed Wednesday in federal court in White Plains, New York. That came nearly 3 weeks after a judge there threw out Giuliani's bankruptcy case after criticizing him for repeated failures to disclose his income sources and to comply with court orders. But after Judge Sean Lane dismissed the bankruptcy case, Giuliani's lawyer said he didn't have the money to pay the creditor's forensic financial advisor as required under bankruptcy laws, according to the judge. That led Lane last week to order all parties to submit proposals on how to end the case by noon Wednesday and prepare for a possible evidentiary hearing on Giuliani's finances if no deal was reached. The judge has to sign off on the agreement, which was filed less than 3 hours before the deadline. The creditors include former Georgia election workers Ruby Freeman and Andrea Shea Moss, who won a $148 million defamation judgment against Giuliani for his false ballot fraud claims against them related to the 2020 election. Freeman and Moss said Giuliani pushed Donald Trump's lies about the election being stolen, which led to death threats that made them fear for their lives. In the agreement filed Wednesday, Giuliani will give his lawyers $100,000 to help pay the creditor's financial advisor, New York-based Global Data Risk, and pay the rest of the firm's expenses from the proceeds of selling either his New York City apartment or Florida condominium, which are worth an estimated $5.6 million and $3.5 million, respectively, according to court documents. Under the agreement, Global Data Risk is also allowed to put liens on the New York City and Florida properties to make sure Giuliani pays all its fees. Rachel Strickland, a lawyer for Freeman and Moss, said in a court filing earlier this month that Global Data Risk racked up $400,000 in expenses during the bankruptcy case. Strickland and Giuliani's bankruptcy lawyers did not immediately return messages seeking comment Wednesday. Lane had said it was troubling that Giuliani was saying he couldn't pay Global Data Risk. In a July 25th order, Lane said, quote, "Even assuming that the debtor does not have the funds on hand to immediately pay these bankruptcy expenses, he certainly has considerable assets upon which he can draw to pay such expenses," end of quote. Freeman and Moss, meanwhile, are now free to seek enforcement and payment of the $148 million verdict in federal court in Washington, D.C., where they won their case. The bankruptcy had put a hold on collection efforts. The bankruptcy was one of a host of legal woes consuming the 80-year-old Giuliani, the ex-federal prosecutor and 2008 Republican presidential candidate who was once heralded as America's mayor for his calm and steady leadership after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. He recently was disbarred as an attorney in New York after a court found he repeatedly made false statements about Trump's 2020 election loss. He is also facing the possibility of losing his law license in Washington after a board in May recommended that he be disbarred. In Georgia and Arizona, Giuliani is facing criminal charges over his role in the effort to overturn the 2020 election. He has pleaded not guilty in both cases. When he filed for bankruptcy, Giuliani listed nearly $153 million in existing or potential debts, including almost $1 million in state and federal tax liabilities, money he owes lawyers, and many millions of dollars in potential judgments and lawsuits against him. He estimated he had assets worth $1 to $10 million. In recent financial filings in the bankruptcy case, he said he had about $94,000 cash in hand at the end of May, while his company, Giuliani Communications, had about $237,000 in the bank. A main source of income for Giuliani over the past 2 years has been a retirement account with a balance of just over $1 million in May, down from nearly $2.5 million in 2022 after his withdrawals. Giuliani was also fired by WABC Radio in New York City because he wouldn't stop talking about Trump being robbed of the 2020 election, which never happened. Trump lost, honestly. Speaking of the election, I'm sure you've heard Donald Trump say that you won't have to vote anymore after this election if he wins, because he's got it all rigged. Well, we have a comment on this story. This is Kelby Vera writing for the Huffington Post. This is dated July 28th. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, could only laugh when asked about Donald Trump saying that people won't have to vote again if they help him get back in office this November. Many wondered if Trump was suggesting something tyrannical when he told supporters at a rally Saturday in West Palm Beach, Florida, that they wouldn't have to worry about casting ballots in 2028 if they elect him this November. He said, quote, "Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. You've got to get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not going to have to vote." End of quote. The comments raised alarm among Trump critics who worried he was hinting at an end to elections as they're normally done if he wins the second term as president. But Graham gleefully downplayed the remarks after being asked Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation if Trump was threatening to, quote, "take the reins of the entire democratic system," end of quote. Graham explained this, quote, "He is trying to tell the Christian community and anybody else who's listening that the nightmare that we're experiencing will soon be over. Give me 4 more years, and I'm going to right this ship called America and pass it on to the next generation," end of quote. That's not what Trump said. That is not what Trump said. Really. Graham continued, quote, "We will have democracy, God willing, for a very long time in this country, but what Donald Trump is trying to tell people, I did it once, I can do it again, these problems can be solved, but you've got to go in a different direction," end of quote. That's not what he said. That is absolutely not what he said. The interview then wrapped without any follow-up questions from moderator Robert Costa. Yeah, because Costa's doing the work of his corporate owners by not asking questions like actual journalists do. Graham wasn't the only conservative who brushed off Trump's remarks on Sunday. Governor Chris Sununu, Republican of New Hampshire, called the comment, quote, "classic Trumpism" in an interview on ABC's This Week, while Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, told CNN State of the Union that the Republican nominee for president was, quote, "obviously making a joke," end of quote. Bullshit. He ain't joking about it, you fucking liar. Although Trump's allies tried to paint his words as harmless, he has openly flirted with the idea of authoritarianism in the past. Last December, he vowed not to be a dictator if reelected, except for day one of a new presidency. Really? No, Trump would be a dictator from day one forward, because that's what he wants to do. Better believe it. You better listen to his words, and you better believe everything he says, because he's telling the truth when he says he wants to be a dictator. Jesus Christ, people, we need to end fascism once and for all, for good in this country. Get out and vote. Unreal. Speaking of the vote, we do have some good news on the endorsement front. This is Tom Krischer and Josh Boak writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 31st out of Detroit. The United Auto Workers on Wednesday endorsed Vice-President Kamala Harris for president, giving her union firepower for the likely contest this November against Republican Donald Trump. UAW President Shawn Fain said in a statement that the union's job in this year's election was to defeat Trump. The union has more than 1 million active and retired members with a strong base in what the Democrats called the blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Fain said, quote, "We can put a billionaire back in office who stands against everything our union stands for, or we can elect Kamala Harris who will stand shoulder to shoulder with us in our war on corporate greed." End of quote. There was never any doubt that the UAW would endorse Harris after President Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race. Biden won the UAW's backing in January and accepted it with a speech at a union political convention in Washington. The AFL-CIO, the umbrella labor organization that includes the UAW, had already endorsed the vice president. Fain needed to wait for the union's executive board to give the nod to Harris, but has repeatedly attacked Trump ahead of the endorsement. In a UAW post early Wednesday on the social media site X, Fain wrote, quote, "There is only one answer to the threat we face as a nation, and it's not another billionaire in office." End of quote. Fain and the union have also called Trump a scab, a derogatory term for workers who cross union picket lines and work during a strike. They also have said he did nothing for workers in Ohio when General Motors closed a factory in 2019. The UAW endorsed Biden's re-election bid in January, just a few months after the Democratic president joined striking General Motors workers on the picket lines near Detroit. The union won big raises last fall after limited strikes at all three Detroit automakers. Shortly after the Biden endorsement, Fain was making multiple television appearances on Biden's behalf. But those waned as the UAW ramped up its campaign to organize non-union auto factories and a spat with a court-appointed union monitor. The UAW says its union members and retirees typically lean toward Democrats, but a sizable number support Republicans. That's consistent with AP VoteCast, which found that 56% of union members and households backed Biden in 2020, while 42% backed Trump. Yeah, 42% scabs. They are scabs. You are a scab when you are in a union and you vote Republican because Republicans hate unions. Better learn from it. You better learn. All right, I got to get to our final story here. This is Matthew Brown writing for the Associated Press. This is dated July 30th out of Billings, Montana. This is the story that we've been talking about on this show for several years now, Jack Prince and I have. So here's an update. At least 973 Native American children died in the U.S. government's abusive boarding school system, according to the results of an investigation released Tuesday by the Interior Department officials who called on the government to apologize for the schools. And I'd say it was more than 973, a hell of a lot more. The investigation commissioned by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland found marked and unmarked graves at 65 of the more than 400 U.S. boarding schools where Native American children were forcibly assimilated into white society. The findings don't specify how each child died, but officials said the causes of death included disease and abuse during a 150-year period that ended in 1969. Additional children may have died after becoming sick at school and being sent home, officials said. They didn't send any of the kids home. Are you kidding me? They sent them to their graves. The findings follow a series of listening sessions held by Haaland over the past 2 years in which dozens of former students recounted harmful and often degrading treatment they endured at the hands of teachers and administrators while separated from their families. Haaland, a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe in New Mexico and the country's first Native American cabinet secretary, said in a Tuesday call with reporters, quote, "The federal government took deliberate and strategic action through boarding school policies to isolate children from their families, deny them their identities, and steal from them the languages, cultures, and connections that are foundational to Native people." End of quote. She added, quote, "Make no mistake, this was a concerted attempt to eradicate the, quote, Indian problem, to either assimilate or destroy native peoples altogether," end of quote. In their initial findings 2 years ago, officials had estimated more than 500 American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children died at the schools. The federal government passed laws and policies in 1819 to support the schools, which were still operating in the 1960s. The schools gave Native American kids English names, put them through military drills, and forced them to perform manual labor such as farming, brick making, and working on railroads. Disgusting. That's what this is. Disgusting. Former students shared tearful recollections of their experience during the listening sessions in Oklahoma, South Dakota, Michigan, Arizona, Alaska, and other states. They talked about being punished for speaking their native language, getting locked in basements, and having their hair cut to stamp out their identities. They were sometimes subjected to solitary confinement, beatings, and withholding of food. Many left the schools with only basic vocational skills that gave them few job prospects. 85-year-old Donovan Archambault, the former chairman of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in Montana, said beginning at age 11, he was sent away to boarding schools where he was mistreated, forced to cut his hair, and prevented from speaking his native language. He said the experience led him to drink alcohol heavily before he turned his life around more than 2 decades later. He never talked about his school days with his children until he wrote a book about the experience several years ago. Archambault told the Associated Press by phone Tuesday, quote, "An apology is needed. They should apologize. But there also needs to be a broader education about what happened to us. To me, it's part of a forgotten history," end of quote. And the only people that are speaking about this are Southpaws and the other very few progressive media sites out there. So we will follow up more on this. That's it for this week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.